You guys with a bunch of text. I am going to pull Reviewr right now, kind of walk you through what this would look like. The goal here is not necessarily to demo Reviewr. Excuse me, it's more so to kind of help you visualize some of these concepts and some of these topics that you can then take and apply to your programs, or if at some point you are interested in diving into Reviewr, how it might work for you, we can do so. So to kind of start things off, from an application perspective, I think so many organizations look at an operations and efficiency. How do we make our lives easier? How do we streamline our time? How do we kind of allow ourselves to focus on other things? But we often fail to forget or remember that you make up a third of the program, right? Your submitters and your applicants, and then of course your volunteers, your committees, and your reviewers make up 75%, right, of the program. And so how do we do what I call as an experience for them that kind of elevates it? So on the application side of things, the number one goal and really the only thing that we care about is how do we lower their barrier for success? We don't want applicants getting bogged down in processes and workflows. If it's more of like an outdated, older process of having fillable PDFs that they have to then recompile and then send to you, right? Your completion rate starts to decline, the quality of the entry starts to go down. If you have very clear eligibility criteria or requirements, how do we not waste people's time applying if they don't fit your needs? Or more importantly, if you offer multiple scholarships or multiple grants, how do we actually go a step further and help align them to whatever opportunity best suits them? So many programs go underfunded or unfunded due to lack of participation because the broader audience doesn't even know that those programs exist. And then for those that are collecting references, which is probably 90% of all scholarships and starting to become a large number of the grants, how do we lower the barrier for the reference? And more importantly, how do we properly collect references? Traditionally speaking, references are a better reflection of the writing ability of the reference, not necessarily who it's for. So, how do you not penalize highly qualified entrants or applicants just because they had a very poorly written reference about them? So, these are some of the core concepts and things that we want to look through. Obviously, on top of all of that is it's 2025, hard to believe, almost 2026. How do we create a very clean, online, modern, user-friendly experience? ADA compliance, save and log out capability, mobile responsiveness, all these small incremental things that absolutely do add up to provide the experience that the applicants desire. So from an application perspective, ideally speaking, whatever platforms you guys use or services, you want to start with your website, right? Your audience and your content and your brand, they're going to go there first anyways. You've got total control over the content and the branding. Let's leverage that. Most organizations that utilize Reviewr will use their sites and then they link over to our system. I do want to kind of start this by talking about a concept called a profile. So if there's one takeaway today, or probably a couple takeaways, this is one of the ones that I want you to kind of lock there in your head. And it's a concept of a profile. With a scholarship or a grant, there are so many moving parts and there's so much data security and compliance that kind of goes into it. You've got people, you've got submissions, you've got files. Now, again, depending on your program, those files are going to differ. It could be resumes and transcripts. It could be tax documentation. It could be verifications of other types of things. It might be FAFSA information. You've got communication, you've got results and scoring, and then without a doubt, and I'm not sure, maybe you can show a raise of hands, how many are collecting ongoing post-impact reports or surveys from your recipients? So the only way that you can systematize these programs and protect yourself is to take every one of those elements I just discussed and centralize them in one place. So we do that through a concept called a profile. So the applicant themselves kind of creates their account, they create their profile, and then it drops them into the submission experience. Now, everything from here on out is kind of strategically designed to lower the barrier for the submitter. We don't want them to get bogged down in processes or workflows. We have a concept called a personalized experience. And so the idea behind that is to leverage technology and tools to kind of guide them through the process versus them trying to force their way through it. All of their time and all of their energy should go towards their content creation and putting forth their best version of their submission, right? So they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. We will come back to that. I would say probably about 75% of submissions do come in the last week if you are very deadline focused. And so if we know that's going to be happening, how do we kind of give the applicants the tools that they need to not lose their information and then potentially not return back later on? The second piece to this is eligibility criteria and opportunity matching. So with most of the organizations that we work with, and it depends on like how many programs you offer or the niche demographic of it, there are some type of high level requirements. It could be looking for certain GPAs or certain demographics of applicants, or they have to be pursuing research in a certain field, right? Again, lots of people today in different industries, keeping it broad. But the number one challenge there is that more times than not, most submitters who are looking for funding will literally just apply to anything and everything. The downside to that is they're going to apply to things that they're not eligible for. So we've wasted their time applying as well as your time vetting through a bunch of people that just don't meet the second phase to it. You can also go one step further on this, and that's not something I have pulled up here for you, is to leverage a nomination-based scholarship or grant. Now, I know you might be thinking like nominations are more like award centric, right? I want to nominate somebody for a certain award. But from a marketing perspective, like you're only getting applicants from those that know about your program. From a proper marketing perspective with social media and outreach, there's a lot of individuals that are going to see your content that may not themselves be a good fit, but they do know somebody else. So instead of having like a link that they kind of ship off and send to them, the person that's going to submit the nomination just simply puts in like the name and email of who they think would be a good fit for your scholarship or for your grant, and then trigger notifications to them. So two really powerful things are happening. Number one is from an application perspective, you got a whole bunch of names, right? Because they were kind of put forth in the nomination. And then two, now that we know who was nominated, we can kind of get them into a cadence. So we know Kyle was nominated for this year's XYZ scholarship or grant. He or she has not yet done anything with that nomination. So we can kind of pound them every 5 days with reminder messages to start their process. So do want to throw that out there, not something that we're visualizing here. But with Reviewr, at least, the idea is to kind of load up all of your different eligibility requirements. It doesn't have to be short form content. It doesn't have to be just drop downs and checkboxes. What we're really doing is building a persona about the scholar and or the grantee, and then using that data to do two things. One is again to check eligibility, and then two, which is what we're looking at here, is we're saying, hey, not only are you eligible, but we offer three different grants or two different scholarships that you actually aligned really well with. Which of or all of these do you want to apply for? And then from there, the submitter or the applicant just selects that individual program and they're on with their life. Now, behind the scenes, a lot of really cool things are happening. We're going to categorize them, right? So if I choose the Future Focus Fund, I'm going to get bucketed with all the other candidates to it. And then two, and you can kind of see that happening here. Once I make my selection, the submission forms are going to be hyper specific and unique, right? So if you are a large organization that offers 15, 20, 40 different scholarships, you can have one single entry point for all of your funding priorities. And then based off of logic, start to spit them out where they belong. So lower barrier for participation, one entry point, but then operationally speaking, you now have like these segments and these buckets to be hyper specific on what you're collecting from them. That also includes things like score sheets and dates and deadlines and workflows, you name it. Now, from a submission perspective, again, this is where it becomes more challenging for me because we're talking about two very different use cases, scholarships versus grants. So I'll tell you from a scholarship perspective, for those of you that guys that do that, if you want to raise hands, I can kind of shift focus if there's like a majority of you doing one type of program or another. So I guess I can kind of just leave a quick message here, scholarships, grants, if you guys want to react to what you guys offer or both. On the scholarship side of things, for me personally, I want to break my scholarships into three kind of data collection formats. One is academic performance, and also like volunteer community service. Number two is financial needs analysis, right? So helping build a bigger picture around like their funding initiatives, if they need funds or not. And then number three is personal storytelling, which to me, from a scholarship perspective, is the number one thing that you should be collecting. It's the only way that you can give your applicants a voice to differentiate themselves versus other people. On the grant making side of things, it's somewhat similar, right? We want to get a better understanding of who you are as a grant organization or a grantee. You're going to be collecting a lot more information on like EINs, tax documentation. You have to kind of build a financial health or risk assessment of them, right? If you're going to cut a $1 million check or grant to a nonprofit or to an organization, like what is the financial risk behind that? So there's some capabilities and some data that we want to be collecting on that. And then we want to get deep into like how the budgets and the funds are going to be utilized. And I think we start to treat that similar to scholarship essays, where we want it to be very personal storytelling. How do these funds align with your mission and vision? Tell us more about how you're going to report back on the impact that you're having. Things like that. So again, the idea here is a very clean, very simple application structure. If there are collaborators being included, we want to make sure that we give them a voice as well. One of the biggest frustrations most grant makers have specifically is somebody sits down to do a grant application, and then so do four other people from their team. And now you're left with four kind of submissions for the same organization. You have to merge them, or if change requests come in, who's making those changes? So the idea is to kind of allow the grantee themselves to kind of load up the system with all of their your team members and collaborators and let them cohesively work together on one centralized project versus having 4 or 5 people submit independently. I mentioned beforehand kind of the segmentation out. So getting a better understanding for like the type of funding that they're looking for, like what is their grant request or how much they're looking to raise. And then obviously the project detail. So everything you see here in Reviewr is completely customizable to your organization. Like literally every scholarship and every grant has a different submission structure and forms. These are just some of the core components that we should leverage. On the grant making side of things, I do believe that you have to have a very structured grant application, which is, obviously getting a better understanding for like not just budgets, but also what is your project, how are you going to measure impact, what are some of the KPIs that you're going to measure yourself against. The reason why I think those components are incredibly important is at some point you are going to have this grantee come back on some type of schedule and they're going to tell you, hey, here's how the grant funding was used, here's how it changed my community's lives, and they're going to build a narrative around the ROI that your program had. And so, since they're the ones who are administering the funds and the ones who are executing the project, we can kind of give them a framework of like how we're going to hold them accountable. But I think it's really important for us in the application to say, how are you going to hold yourself accountable? Like, what is the definition of success? And then that's what gets baked into your impact reporting. So at some point in time when this grantee comes back, there's going to be standard questions that they're going to need to answer about their funds that you're asking them. But also, by the way, you told us that you're going to measure impact on these 3 or 4 things. Now self-report on how those 3 or 4 things were done. So part of a higher level concept here again is the profile. Everything that you see here is going to get logged on their account. From a data security and privacy perspective, not knowing how you currently run your programs, if you are ever downloading and exporting things like tax documentation, financials, FAFSA information, or anything that's highly sensitive or secure, social security numbers, you're putting yourself at risk. So whatever system or tool that you use to collect that information, and by the way, those tools shouldn't be emails and spreadsheets and like handwritten PDFs. They should be a safe, secure portal. Once they come in, they should theoretically never leave that tool just to protect you and the applicants themselves. Now, with that said, we're going to come back to this on the review side. Just because you collect highly confidential information doesn't mean you have to share it, right? So if I, as a review committee member, come in to look at this application, like, yes, I want to see their budgets. Yes, I want to see how they're going to use the funds for their proposals. But do I need to see their tax documentation or their proof of EIN? Probably not. So you can kind of redact some of that data as we go. The last piece here before we start to talk more about what I just referenced are those references. I'm going to add another quick chat. Anyone collecting references? Just get a show of hands here. How many people are collecting letters of recommendation or letters of support on their submissions? This is kind of an older school methodology where, traditionally speaking, the reference is a letter and either gets submitted directly by the applicant or sent to you directly. Now, the two challenges with that is that generally they're private, so the applicants themselves shouldn't really see the content in it. Two is that the reference emails it to you directly. It's harder to redact that information. And then you're left trying to scramble to figure out like, who is this, who is it for, and how do I connect it later on? The bigger challenge, though, is a reference letter in itself is very old school. They're being asked at the very last minute to write references. It's generally a better reflection of the writing ability of the reference, not necessarily who it's about. So how do we kind of do a paradigm shift in how we properly collect this information? So in Reviewr, the applicants themselves will put in like the name and email of who is submitting the reference. And then an email notification can be sent out saying, hey, so and so, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Kyle. Click here to do so. And that brings you into a dedicated reference portal. And so the idea behind this is number one is it lowers the barrier for those references or external individuals submitting content. They just come into the system and they answer the questions as they appear. Number two is that you template it. So instead of saying, hey, write a full-blown letter from scratch, now we're saying, hey, rank this grantee or rank this scholar on a series of qualities that we're looking for. And then instead of a letter, here's like 3 very short, like 200-word essay prompts that we want you to answer. So it's a similar concept to a letter, it just lowers the barrier. Now, where things kind of take off from here is once they submit, what happens next? Because we talked about profiles, as soon as this reference gets submitted, it goes back to the scholar or to the grantee's proposal or to their profile, all centralized for you in real time. So I want to look at some of that stuff. Before I do that, though, I want to address some of the operational challenges. Um, Right now, I'm going to make a large assumption. Most organizations who are not using a dedicated scholarship or grant management platform probably use in the ballpark of 6 to 8 different tools to administer their programs. They use built-in web forms, which could be like your Survey Monkeys or your Jot forms or their homegrown tools. They're using some type of online storage system, so databases, CRMs, Google Drive, Dropbox, you name it. And then from there, what ends up happening is they start to recompile this information, build out these packets, and then share them with the review teams. So from a review team perspective, they're basically, and in between there, there's a lot of data redaction. You're emailing, doing communication. You're trying to build out these workflows. On the review side, they typically come in, they go and find their folders, they download all the proposals. They're toggling back and forth between like their inbox, their spreadsheets, and then whatever tools that they're using to view the content. They log all their feedback in a spreadsheet and then ship it back to you. And then for every single reviewer, they're basically having to download and export and recompile the results. So there's a lot of room there for both human error, but also a whole lot of time for humans. Right now, the average volunteer hourly rate is about $34.79. And I think a lot of times we don't think of volunteers from a monetary perspective, but they do have a set hourly rate standard. And so if you had 100 submissions and you asked one person to review all 100, they're going to be about a $850 cost, right, associated with it. Now, again, that may not be a hard cost, it's a time cost, but it's still something to take into consideration. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how do we kind of button up some of the operations to ensure compliance, but also streamline some of those operations. So from an administrative perspective, I'm not going to get too deep into Reviewr whatsoever on this. Again, the goal here is to talk more about like a compliance element. You have to have a dedicated command center that manages like the ins and outs of the program. So at least within Reviewr, we give you dashboarding. You can track in real time your dates and your deadlines. You can track progress. You can track recent activity. On the progress side of things, again, if you're looking to grow your programs, just in itself, monitoring the number of incomplete or in progress submissions is incredibly valuable because from there, obviously within Reviewr, we can see how many there are, who they are, how far they made it. You can start to build out these like cadences or these triggers. So like every 5 days, send a reminder until they complete. We do the same thing for references, right? So if everybody has to submit 2 references, it'll say, hey, look, here's how many references have been requested. Here's done, who's not done. And those that are not done, you can automate the reminder process to them as well. I do want to kind of physically show you that profile concept just so you guys can help visualize it. So my goal with you guys, again, is not just from a compliance data security perspective, avoid downloading stuff, but you have to be using the dedicated tools for the task at hand. So ideally within a Reviewr, yes, you can still generate reports and do that information, but all of the actual scholarship and grant administration is done on one dedicated hub and you never leave the tool. So instead of going to Jotform and trying to find like a list or a survey of all of your submissions and export them in Reviewr, you get a very simple menu. And you can sort and filter by your different scholarships and your different grants and your submission statuses. But to help you visualize that profile concept, once I click on a grantee's name, so in this case, the Roots and Wings Foundation, you can instantly visualize the profile. So I have all of the content we've collected from them in the submission experience. So budgets, location, collaborators, tell us a bit more about like your situation, how the funds are going to be used, everything in one place. There are built-in communication tools. So you can do individual emailing, bulk emailing. There's also a one-to-one direct messaging tool within the system. This is very popular for a couple different reasons. We live in a really terrible time right now where if you were to notify somebody that they were selected for a scholarship or for a grant, they're now being targeted by hackers, right? Especially if there's a dollar amount associated with it. Like they are literally targeting scholars or students and grantees who are getting funded, which makes sense, right? So to combat that, if you have any of these highly confidential messages you want to send, you can log it in Reviewr on their profile, trigger a notification, and then they come back into a dedicated safe portal to actually view that content to help protect them. Also, if you're requesting additional deliverables from them, so like payment schedules, scholarship acceptance packets, or any ongoing data, since it brings them back in, they can actually take action on it. Similar type of feature for note taking. So if your team wants to collaborate, you can leave notes about individual submissions. Those notes stay private amongst yourselves. The applicants themselves will never actually see it. And then from a file upload perspective, so again, most of you are collecting multiple documents and deliverables, financials, budgets, tax documentation, FAFSA. There's a wide range of type of content. In Reviewr, the idea is to centralize that. So if I press view next to the file, it will literally embed itself right in front of you. So visually speaking, not a great example. It's a spreadsheet. It's a fake one for that matter. But this could be a video file. It could be a photo. It could be a PowerPoint. It could be a PDF. But the goal is to allow you guys to visually in one spot go from form to files to notes to results. And then in this case, also what I call supporting documentation, which might be your references. So for those that collect references, as soon as they get submitted, it gets stuck on their profile. And then when you press view, you can actually embed it right in front of us. I am going to come back to this here momentarily, or I guess I can just talk about it now, which is impact reporting. So we'll kind of just go with the flow today. One of the core concept behind impact reporting is extremely simple, right? You need to collect information from those that you fund in order to measure ROI, as well as summarize the results, right? So like the type of projects that you're funding, maybe demographic details, success rates, whatever those internal parameters are that you want to measure. However, in practice, it's not that simple. What ends up happening is once an organization gets funded, it's not ever going to be top of mind for them to come back to do self-reporting, right? Like they don't wake up 1 year from now saying, "Hey, I owe the XYZ Foundation my grant impact report." They're going to procrastinate it, they're going to delay it, you name it. So, in order for us to make this a reality, two things need to happen. Number one is that we have to have an extremely low barrier way for them to do their self-reporting. Number two is once they do the reporting, we have to be able to collect it in a way that we can aggregate it and then start to compare to other candidates. The end goal here will be like, hey, in the course of 2025, we funded, 14 organizations at an average dollar amount of this. Here's the type of programs that we funded. Here's how they're measuring success. If it's a scholarship organization, like you can fast forward 3 years from now and say, hey, over the last 3 years, our average scholar graduated college with XYZ% less debt than the normal average. They went on to pursue degrees in a certain career field. Their starting salary is X% higher than the industry average, right? That's like the end of the spectrum type of data that could be realistic if done properly. So, again, to make this very simple for you, what's going to happen is in this case, Michael, who is a scholar or a grantee, would get a notification saying, hey, it's time for you to come back and do your impact report. And all they simply do is come back into their profile, they click add new, and then says, well, what are you trying to add? And you'll say impact report or scholarship acceptance packet or whatever that deliverable is. As soon as they select it, it pops up right in front of them. So they literally just fill it out in one sitting. Now, from a tracking perspective, you guys are able to look in real time at how many people are in that stage, right? So maybe it's 1 year from now, and you want to look at how many net new grantees you have, who's currently in review, who's in the renewal stage, and then who's in the impact stage. You can visualize it, but also those that are in the impact stage, are they done or not done? And if they're not done, you can start to automate your reminders to them. So it gives you complete visibility. You have automated reminder capability. From an applicant perspective, they just log back into where they started and they fill it out. Now, where the magic happens is that once they submit, it shows up in their list. So you have like a line item called like 2025 impact report or whatever you want to call it. Once you open it up, it'll then actually embed that content directly in front of you. So this is a real impact report with dummy data built in. So here's the organization, here's the dates of their grant, here is their initial stated goals versus the actual outcomes, as well as explanations of any discrepancies between them. If you remember beforehand, we always want to ask the applicant, like, what are some of the KPIs that you're going to use to measure success? We kind of load them in here. What was your target? What's your actual? Tell us more about the impact, quantitative, qualitative, budget utilization, key successes, lessons learned, what worked, what didn't work, how sustainable is this, updates on financials. Again, whatever deliverables you want to collect from the grantees. But because this lives on their account, now if I had 100 submissions, if I had 10 submissions or 10,000 submissions, we can aggregate all of this data into like impact reports and dashboards for you guys. So incredibly impactful stuff there. The last thing I want to look at, and I know we kind of bounce over the place a little bit, is the review and selection. So at the end of the day, this is the number one most important component, potentially. The impact reporting might take that cake process, which is how do you conduct a very fair, compliant, non-biased review and selection process? Again, easier said than done. If you have three grant applications, it's definitely easier than if you had 300 of them. But at the end of the day, you're taking in a bunch of very private, confidential information. You need a team to subjectively look at them and then narrow it down and make a selection of who you're going to fund. Unless you're fortunate and you live in a world with infinite funding, which if that's the case, we should be friends, you're not going to be able to award every single applicant. So there has to be like a decision-making matrix that goes into place to properly do your selection. Some of the data that we have suggests that on average, most volunteer reviewers or committee members physically cannot review more than 30 submissions. And I know the world's not perfect. It's not black and white. Some of you may not have a choice. But we have pretty clear data that suggests that if they scored 42 people, the 42nd person, even though it was the same score sheet, was not scored on the same scale as the first person, right? Energy levels start to drop off. All of the applicants start to look similar to each other. They're not making edits. And so if that is the case, how do we provide the tools to them to actually, randomize it, maybe lower the workload capacity for your review team? So I'm just going to walk you guys through this. I think this is a very common example of how Reviewr is used. So for me personally, everything starts with data redaction. And this is, again, it can be a bit challenging because you might have file uploads that are coming in like tax documentation or FAFSA that does have PII. We're hosting a webinar in 2 weeks, I think the first week of September. And we're going to talk a lot about like what the future of AI looks like in both scholarship and grant management. So stay tuned. We're going to get really deep into that and how AI can help solve that challenge. But ideally speaking, if you're collecting any information that could potentially alter the perception from your committees, demographics, name, PII, location, right? You should hide it from them. Number two is if you're collecting highly personal, sensitive data that doesn't influence the selection, we should hide that as well. Again, just from a data security perspective, but also to avoid overwhelming them with content not necessary for selection. Once that's been done, we need to create these review workflows, right? And so I'm a huge advocate of bucketing. How do we start to segment out our submissions into more bite-sized teams? That way, I, as a volunteer, am not looking at 150 people, I'm looking at 15 people. And you can do that a lot of different ways. I'm not going to go through all that today. In this example, I kind of set up two high-level versions of it. One is by funding area or by category or by grant, right? So arts and leadership, audience development, right? Whatever it might be, future funding. And then number two is phases of review. I know there's one organization here who's currently a client of Reviewr on the call today that has well north of 1,000 submissions, right? And they have to go from 1,000 down to like 15 to 20 entrants or selections. You're not going to do that in one setting, right? So the idea is to take this larger number, go through a high level vetting process, narrow it down to like what the top 40, top 50%, and then from there go through more judging, scoring, a bit more granular. Maybe you do interviews, and you keep like pushing people lower and lower through that pipeline until you get to your final selections. So how do you do that in a reviewer? When people submit or create their profiles, we can automatically categorize them for you, right? So everybody can go into phase one. If you offer three different scholarships, it can drop them into whatever scholarship pertains to them. And then from there, we can kind of create these committees. Now, if you are an organization where your team reviews every single submission, that's totally fine. You just assign your team to every single bucket. But the idea here is that in the arts and leadership residency, whenever Sally, Sue, and Steve log in, they only see those entries. When Simon, Paul, and Mark come in, they only view future focus funding, right? So it allows you to build these dedicated teams or pods in charge of one specific segment or category of entrants. From there, if you open these buckets up, and this is what I want to spend the majority of my time talking about, is our pairing tools. So just because you started to segment them out, what if you want to say, hey, look, I want every single person who applies to my grant or to my scholarship to get looked at 3 times or 5 times? Or what if we want to say our team should never look at more than 15 people? You can actually start to bulk select and then just type those numbers in. So literally, like give my submissions to 3 reviewers. And then the system will then equally and randomly take them and then assign them out. Once done, if there's ever conflicts of interest, you can totally override that and manually pair people. Another really cool feature that we just launched, so for those who are currently working with Reviewr, this is probably new to you. It's called judge queuing. So the idea behind that is you basically say, hey, look, as a volunteer, you may want to look at a lot of people because you do have the bandwidth. Others might want to look at a lot of people, but then life happens and they can't fulfill their obligation. So to avoid you having to go back and do reassignments and figure out who's been reviewed, you actually take all of your submissions and then share it with your entire team. At that point, you set a threshold. So maybe like every submission should be reviewed 5 times. So when the team comes in to review, they can score as few or as many as they want. But once that particular entrant is scored 5 times, it falls off that list and nobody else can evaluate them. So when the review team comes in to score, if it's in front of them, it still needs to be reviewed. So it's kind of a pretty powerful tool for you guys to kind of like, A, allow people to score as many as they want, but also B, ensure that every applicant is scored like the exact number of times. I'm going to come back to this because I just introduced a major problem, and that problem is data normalization. So whenever you randomly assign submissions to your team for review, that implies that not every reviewer looks at the same people. So what happens in this example of like Mark, however, is like a hard ass and he always scores way lower than his or her peers. How do you not penalize a scholar or a grantee who unfortunately got paired up with Mark? So what ends up happening in Reviewr is we want to focus on qualitative analysis. So when the team comes in to conduct their review and selection, they get a very clean, simple menu. Again, I got 2 little kids. If I'm part of your volunteer committee, I'm doing this on my tablet at 10:30, ideally out on Wednesday. Hopefully not much later than that. And you can't physically ask me to go to Google Drive, download things, go to spreadsheets. I need to have one-stop shop for my task at hand. So if you are redacting the data, things like name and demographics won't show up. They simply click into the scholar or the grantee that they want to review, and they get a very simple split screen. So half of the page is the applicant profile or the elements you want them to see, and then the other half is your selection tool. So both of these are independent. So what this means is that your team kind of side by side read through the application, log their comments, log their scores. They can check out the file uploads, which do get embedded in Reviewr. So again, I can look at projects, I can look at resumes, I can look at comments and notes. I can check out those references, and then I can answer my scorecard. So scorecards are completely custom built. You guys have full control over what you want to review on. Ideally speaking, though, you want your scorecards to follow the flow of your form. Number two is obviously your scorecard should match like what you're looking for in a grantee or a scholar. So like what's the mission and vision of your program? Number three, and this is kind of a best practice, is try to elicit an emotional response from the review team. So a lot of our clients at one point would say, hey, rank this person's XYZ on a scale from 0 to 20. The problem with that is most reviewers get really bogged down in the numbers. Like, how do you differentiate a 16 versus a 17? And on a low end, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but at scale with averages, it certainly does influence the results. It's also a lot longer review process. So if you were to elicit an emotional response, which is actually what you see here, from entirely agree to entirely disagree, rank their understanding of the current state of operations, rate the project, it's much quicker for reviews because they're just offering like their emotional response. Yet behind the scenes, there still are point values associated with it. So you can still run your scorecards and your selection sheets. So again, I mentioned before that on average, if you had 100 submissions, it's costing about 100, $860 per volunteer judge. Not a made up number, very true. Hopefully this model here reduces that by 4x, right? They have literally 2 clicks, one to open the entry, and then two is however many it takes to evaluate it. Now, once they're done reviewing, you guys then get these leaderboards. And this will show you on a per bucket basis every applicant you received, who reviewed them, if they've even reviewed them or not, right? I talked about how applicants procrastinate, so do your committees. So if you want to send reminder messages to them, you certainly can. And we start to tabulate this, right? So we give you individual scores, total scores, averages. Many of our clients who are on the larger end will take this data and create like a cutoff line. And then at the bottom, they just move them on to the next bucket. And they rinse and repeat their judging process until they have a much smaller number for final deliberation. At that point, this page gets pulled up and they say, hey, team, here's the results. Let's now talk about why we scored the way that we did. So I know I'm going long here. I want to leave you with one last thing, and that's that normalization, right? Because it's a big issue that we see on a daily basis. And you can see it happening right here to Sheldon. So Mark scored Sheldon a 12. So my first question is, okay, did Mark just score Sheldon low because it was a poor quality entrant? And if so, why did Judge Judy score to 31, right? That's a massive swing between those two. And because of that, Sheldon's being penalized. So this report that I'm going to jump way ahead and show you is called normalization. Don't get too bogged down on what you see here. Focus on the green. And what this is basically doing is it's giving you your individual judging tendencies on a per volunteer slash judge basis. So Judge Judy collectively on average scores about a 24, but Tony on average scores about a 34. So the data is very clear. If I, as a grantee or scholar, was reviewed by Judge Judy, I am not going to be selected. And that's just the facts because I'm scoring 10 points lower than Tony. So now that we know that, you can leverage this data to set expectations and train your judges, right? Realign them. Or you say, look, we recruited you to be a judge or a volunteer because we value your opinion. So we don't really care what this data says. Because what this data really tells us is that Judge Judy and Tony scored the exact same. 24 is her average, 34 is Tony's average. So then what we can do is using the normalization, we now start to compare individual judges' averages to one another. So the end result looks kind of goofy. Like your highest rated applicant might be like a 1.2, which means they scored like 20% higher than the collective average. Whereas the lowest rated applicant might be like a zero point 0.8, which is 20% lower than the collective average. So by no means is this required, but when we live in a time where there's funding on the line, like there is no stone that should go unturned to make sure that we are providing a fair, non-biased, compliant experience for the applicants. And I'm going to go ahead and open this up for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions or comments, toss it in the chat. But while I do that, I also want to leave it at a concept called proof of process. I'm a very firm advocate that an indie funding program on the very front end, we have to have a statement which is called a proof of process that says, look, if you're going to apply to our scholarship or to our grant, this is what your experience will look like. These are the dates and deadlines. This is the application form. This is the scorecard that's going to be filled out. Your data is going to be redacted. You're going to be randomly reviewed. We're going to try to avoid normalization, right? And then behind the scenes, you have all the different tools in place that one-to-one compare to your proof of process. If anybody ever calls you up and says, I wasn't selected, I don't agree with it, and here's why, you now have the data that you need to protect yourself. Again, auditing and compliance is incredibly important when we're dealing with dollars. And you might think, well, this will never happen to me. It certainly could. I see it happen all the time where organizations get called by the applicants who say, I was not selected because of my XYZ reason, right? And without having a proof of process in place and the data that shows that you followed it, you're putting yourself at unnecessary risk. So I'm going to mute myself, get a sip of water. Any questions you guys have, toss them in the chat and we'll hang out for as long as you want. Questions can be about the platform, about the topic. It could be about anything else that you guys want to address today. Like I mentioned before, while I'm waiting for questions. We'll send out a recap of this. I'll try my best to get the recording sent to you guys here, even as early as today. With that said, there's gonna be a broader follow-up that have like the recording. We're gonna convert this into like a blog with like actual action steps of how to start to implement some of these theories and processes. Obviously, I'm not naive. Some of you guys might be interested in learning about Reviewr. If you guys want to have that discussion and kind of dive deeper into like how we can assist, I would love to have that opportunity. Others are here for pure information exploratory. Also, happy to do that type of stuff as well. We're very fortunate that we live in a world that we have, thousands and thousands of these programs powered by Reviewr. I used to say that I've seen everything and there's no right or wrong way to run a scholarship or grant. I've now rephrased that. There certainly are wrong ways. There's also a lot of right ways. And so we're all about trying to align best practices, emerging trends, best practices. We also take that into consideration during our implementation of Reviewr. Again, we have some clients on the call here today that may not know this. We've got a whole suite of new tools for self-launching of the platform, right? So we have some organizations that will sign up and build it out. Others will send us their forms and basically have us load up a framework for them, and then we review it. The non-negotiable for us, though, is the education. So we always do kickoff calls we want to audit like what your current environment processes and workflows look like. Like where do you want to be 2 years from now? And then it allows our team to kind of help make sure that A, you're leveraging Reviewer to the maximum potential. There's going to be features that we have that you're not going to be aware of. And then two, like what are we seeing other organizations do that's both unique and successful? And if you want to incorporate them, that's great. If not, we understand that. But we're very education driven. So if there's questions that I can't answer, I certainly can help find the answers for you guys. Any questions? I don't know if we caught the afternoon post-lunch lull or there's just no follow-up questions. But again, I'll hang out for as long as you guys want. We'll give it a few more minutes. Okay. Nice and quiet today. So keep an eye out for that follow-up. I'll do my best just to at least drop you guys a link to like the video recap, but then the more broad follow-up with like all those other resources and best practices I'll share out. This interactive tour that we ran through here, again, while relatively simple and relatively basic, this was part of what we call our grant makeover series. We actually host multiple of these for different use cases of Reviewr, so scholarships, grants, recognition programs, board nominations. It's a series that we want to do at least probably monthly, if not every 2 months. We hosted this last one about 2 weeks ago, where we collect like an open call for submission. So organizations that do scholarships, grants, you name it, they tell us like their forms, how they've done things in the past, some of their challenges. And we take that and we load their program into Reviewr. So obviously you guys can visualize how we took in this case a tool that was using a combination of spreadsheets and like I think it was SurveyMonkey to collect applications, transformed it into Reviewr, but then also layered on things that didn't exist beforehand. So impact reporting, acceptance, fund disbursements, fund tracking, a bunch of other components. So in my follow-up, I'm going to actually send that recap as well in case anybody's interested. If your current kind of grant management process consists of spreadsheets and other form tools, hopefully that resonates here a little bit for you guys as well. But I do appreciate you guys attending today and your participation. And as always, if there's anything I can do for you, not just from a platform perspective and reviewer related, but best practices or making introductions, want to make sure I'm doing whatever I can. So just let me know. Thank you guys so much.